What you are about to hear is something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Something so explosive, so diplomatically catastrophic, that historians will be writing about this moment for the next 100 years. And if you think you already know what happened between the United States and Canada, I promise you, the full story is far more disturbing than anything you have seen in the headlines. Let me set the scene for you. Picture the most important military alliance in human history. An alliance that has kept the world from descending into chaos since the end of World War II. An alliance that has seen soldiers from dozens of nations fight side by side, bleed together, and in many cases, die together defending the values of freedom and democracy. Now imagine the leader of the most powerful nation in that alliance, the nation that essentially built this system, standing before the world and ripping it apart with his bare hands. Not through some carefully calculated strategic withdrawal, not through diplomatic channels, but through public humiliation, threats, and what many are calling the single most disrespectful statement ever made about fallen Allied soldiers. This is not a movie. This is not a hypothetical scenario designed to scare you. This is happening right now, and the implications for global security, for your safety, and for the future of the Western world are almost impossible to overstate. By the time you finish watching this video, you will understand exactly what Trump did, why George Conway says it represents something far more dangerous than mere diplomatic incompetence, and what this means for every single person watching, no matter where you live in the world. Let us start at the beginning, because to truly understand the weight of what has happened, you need to understand what NATO actually means and why threatening it is like playing with matches in a room filled with dynamite. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in 1949 when the world was still recovering from the deadliest conflict in human history. The idea was simple but revolutionary. If one member nation was attacked, all member nations would respond as if they themselves had been attacked. This principle, enshrined in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, has been invoked exactly once in the alliance's history. And here is where this story takes its first dark turn. The only time Article 5 has ever been activated was on September 12, 2001, the day after the terrorist attacks that killed nearly 3,000 Americans on American soil. And who answered that call? Who sent their young men and women into the mountains of Afghanistan to fight and die alongside American soldiers? Canada, our neighbor to the north, the nation that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States. The nation that has been America's closest ally for over a century. What followed was 2 decades of sacrifice. Canadian soldiers served with distinction in Afghanistan, fighting in some of the most dangerous regions of that war-torn country. Kandahar province, the heartland of the Taliban insurgency, became a Canadian responsibility. And the cost was staggering. Young Canadian men and women came home in flag-draped coffins. Families were destroyed. Communities were shattered. The number varies depending on how you count, but the sacrifice of NATO allies in Afghanistan, including Canadians, British, Germans, Poles, and soldiers from dozens of other nations, represents one of the greatest demonstrations of international solidarity in military history. Now keep all of that in your mind as we move to what has happened in recent weeks. The relationship between Donald Trump and Canada has always been complicated. From the very beginning of his political career, Trump has seemed to view Canada not as an ally, not as a friend, but as a competitor to be dominated. The renegotiation of NAFTA, the trade disputes, the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, all of these were framed not as negotiations between partners, but as battles to be won against an adversary. But what happened recently has crossed a line that many believed was uncrossable. Trump's recent statements about essentially removing Canada from America's sphere of consideration, about treating our northern neighbor as something less than an ally, have sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. But it was what came next that truly revealed the depth of the crisis we are facing. When discussing NATO commitments and the sacrifices made by allied nations, Trump made comments that George Conway, the prominent conservative lawyer and vocal Trump critic, described as perhaps the most offensive statements ever made by an American president about fallen soldiers. And this is where I need you to really pay attention, because what I am about to explain to you is the kind of thing that most media outlets are either too afraid or too confused to properly analyze. George Conway, for those who may not know, is not some liberal activist looking to score political points. He is a deeply conservative lawyer who worked on cases against the Clinton administration. He was seriously considered for positions in Trump's own Justice Department. His wife, Kellyanne Conway, was one of Trump's most loyal advisors. When George Conway speaks about the legal and constitutional implications of a president's actions, he brings a perspective that cannot be dismissed as partisan bias. And what he has said about Trump's recent statements regarding NATO allies and their fallen soldiers is absolutely damning. According to Conway's analysis, Trump's comments represent more than just diplomatic incompetence. They represent a fundamental misunderstanding of what alliances mean, what sacrifice means, and what American leadership in the world actually requires. Conway has pointed out that when a president publicly dismisses or demeans the sacrifices made by Allied soldiers who died fighting alongside Americans, he is not just insulting those specific nations. He is sending a message to every country in the world that partnership with America is worthless, that dying for shared values alongside American troops will earn you nothing but contempt. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. There are soldiers serving in Allied nations right now who are watching what the American president says about their fallen comrades. There are military leaders in Europe, in Asia, in the Pacific, who are reconsidering whether their nations should continue to tie their security to an alliance with the United States. There are adversaries in Moscow, in Beijing, in Tehran, who are watching this unfold and realizing that their strategy of dividing the Western alliance is working beyond their wildest dreams. Let me take you inside what is actually happening in the halls of power, because the public statements are only the tip of a very large and very dangerous iceberg. When Trump makes comments dismissing Canadian contributions to shared defense, he is not just engaging in his typical rhetorical style. He is activating a cascade of consequences that most people never see. Intelligence sharing between nations becomes more complicated. Military planning becomes more difficult. Trust, the fundamental currency of any alliance, begins to erode in ways that are almost impossible to repair. I spoke to a source who has worked in NATO coordination, and what they told me was chilling. They said that in their decades of experience, they have never seen Allied confidence in American leadership so shaken. They said that conversations that used to be straightforward, conversations about joint operations, about shared intelligence, about coordinated responses to threats, now begin with a question that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Can we trust that America will still be there when we need them? This is the damage that George Conway has been trying to explain to the American public. It is not about hurt feelings. It is not about diplomatic niceties. It is about the fundamental architecture of global security that has kept major wars from breaking out for nearly 80 years. And that architecture is crumbling. Now let me tell you something that will help you understand why this is personal for so many people, and why the reference to 457 fallen NATO soldiers carries such emotional weight. In the mountains of Afghanistan, in the deserts of Iraq, in peacekeeping missions around the world, soldiers from NATO nations have served and died in operations that were fundamentally about supporting American security interests. When the United States was attacked on September 11th, it was NATO allies who said, "We stand with you." When American generals needed additional forces in the most dangerous parts of Afghanistan, it was NATO allies who answered the call. The 457 figure represents a specific accounting of Allied casualties in operations where NATO solidarity was being tested. Each of those soldiers had a family. Each of them had hopes and dreams that were cut short in service of an alliance they believed in. And when an American president makes comments that dismiss or demean that sacrifice, he is not just insulting governments. He is insulting the memories of real people who died trusting that their sacrifice would be honored. George Conway has been particularly eloquent on this point. He has explained that the office of the presidency carries certain obligations that transcend partisan politics. One of those obligations is to honor the sacrifices made by those who serve, including those who serve alongside American forces as allies. When a president fails in this obligation, Conway argues, he is not just making a political mistake. He is betraying a sacred trust. But here is where the story gets even more complicated, and where I need to explain something that most commentators are missing. Trump's apparent hostility toward Canada and toward NATO allies generally is not random. It is not just the product of a difficult personality or a lack of diplomatic experience. There is a pattern here, a consistent thread that connects his statements about Canada to his statements about Germany to his statements about the European Union to his curious reluctance to criticize certain other world leaders. George Conway has been among those who have traced this pattern most carefully. He has pointed out that Trump's criticisms always seem to target nations that are democratic allies of the United States. Meanwhile, his praise and admiration seems reserved for leaders who rule through authoritarian means. This pattern, Conway argues, reveals something deeply troubling about how Trump views the world and America's place in it. Consider what we have seen just in the past few months. Canada, one of America's closest allies, treated as an adversary. Britain, the nation with whom America shares the special relationship, kept at arm's length. Germany, the powerhouse of European democracy, subjected to constant criticism. And through it all, kind words and understanding for leaders in Moscow and elsewhere who would celebrate the dissolution of Western unity. If you wanted to design a strategy to weaken the Western alliance, to isolate America from its natural partners, to create openings for authoritarian powers to expand their influence, you could not do much better than what we have witnessed in recent years. And George Conway has been warning that this is exactly what is happening, whether by design or by instinct. Let me now explain why Canada specifically has become such a target, because there are factors at play here that go beyond personal animosity. Canada represents something that seems to particularly irritate certain political instincts. It is a nation that provides universal health care to its citizens. It is a nation that maintains strict gun regulations while still respecting hunting traditions. It is a nation that has welcomed refugees and immigrants while maintaining a strong national identity. In other words, Canada is a living example of the possibility of a different kind of politics, and that example threatens certain narratives about what is and is not possible. When Trump attacks Canada, when he threatens to absorb it as a state, when he dismisses its contributions and sacrifices, he is doing more than just engaging in diplomatic malpractice. He is attacking the idea that there might be another way, a different model that democratic nations could follow. And this is why Canadians have responded with such unified outrage. They understand that what is at stake is not just trade deals or border policies. What is at stake is their national identity and their right to chart their own course in the world. George Conway has connected these dots in ways that deserve more attention. He has pointed out that the attacks on Canada fit a broader pattern of attacking institutions and norms that provide alternatives to a certain vision of power. Democratic allies are attacked. International institutions are undermined. The press is labeled as enemies of the people. And through it all, the only value that seems to remain constant is loyalty to one person rather than to principles or institutions. Now I want to take you through something that the mainstream media has largely failed to explain properly, which is what all of this means for ordinary people, for you and for your family. When America's alliances weaken, when nations that have stood together begin to drift apart, the consequences are not just diplomatic. They are economic, they are security-related, and they are deeply personal. Consider the trade relationship between the United States and Canada. Billions of dollars in goods and services cross that border every single day. Millions of American jobs depend on that trade relationship functioning smoothly. When a president declares economic war on Canada, American workers feel the consequences. Prices rise, jobs disappear, communities that depend on cross-border trade are devastated. But the economic consequences, as severe as they are, pale in comparison to the security implications. For 80 years, North America has been essentially a unified security zone. Canada and the United States have cooperated on air defense through NORAD. Intelligence has flowed freely between the two nations. The threat of attack from the north has been essentially zero because of the depth of trust between the two nations. What happens when that trust erodes? What happens when Canadian leaders begin to wonder whether they can rely on the United States? What happens when intelligence sharing becomes more guarded, when military cooperation becomes more complicated, when the smooth functioning of continental defense begins to break down? These are not hypothetical questions. These are the questions that defense planners in both countries are grappling with right now. And George Conway has warned that the answers to these questions could reshape North American security in ways that make everyone less safe. Let me now address something that I know many of you are thinking. You might be wondering whether this is all being exaggerated, whether the diplomatic tensions we are seeing are really as serious as I am making them sound. I want to speak to that concern directly. In my years of following international affairs, I have never seen anything like what is happening right now. I have never seen a major alliance so openly questioned by its leader. I have never seen allied nations so publicly insulted by an American president. I have never seen the fundamental assumptions of Western security so openly challenged from within. This is not normal diplomatic friction. This is not the kind of give and take that happens in any relationship between nations. This is something categorically different, and the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we can begin to grapple with what it means. George Conway has used his legal training to explain why these developments are so significant. He has pointed out that treaties have force precisely because they represent commitments that transcend individual leaders. When a president repeatedly signals that he does not take treaty commitments seriously, he is not just making a policy choice. He is undermining the entire concept of international law and international agreements. And once that concept is undermined, it becomes almost impossible to rebuild. Think about what this means for any future American president who tries to negotiate an international agreement. Why would any nation trust American commitments when they have seen how quickly those commitments can be discarded? Why would any country make sacrifices for an alliance with America when they have seen how those sacrifices are repaid with insults and threats? This is the damage that is being done, not just to current relationships, but to the very possibility of future cooperation. And it is damage that will take generations to repair, if it can be repaired at all. As we approach the end of this video, I want to leave you with something to think about, something that I believe is more important than any of the specific incidents or statements we have discussed. The world order that emerged after World War II was not inevitable. It was built through conscious effort, through the sacrifice of millions, through the wisdom of leaders who understood that cooperation served everyone's interest better than conflict. That world order created the conditions for unprecedented prosperity and peace. It created the conditions that allowed technology to flourish, that allowed trade to expand, that allowed billions of people to lift themselves out of poverty. That world order is now in jeopardy, not because of external enemies, although those certainly exist, but because of choices being made by leaders who do not seem to understand what they are destroying. George Conway has been among the clearest voices explaining this danger. He has used his platform to warn that we are witnessing something historic, something that will be studied for centuries as an example of how quickly things can fall apart. The comments about Canada, the insults to fallen NATO soldiers, these are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a deeper pathology, a fundamental misunderstanding of what makes America strong and what keeps the world safe. I want you to share this video because understanding what is happening is the first step to doing something about it. I want you to subscribe to this channel because we are going to continue following this story as it develops. And I want you to remember the 457 fallen soldiers whose sacrifice is being dishonored, because they deserve to be remembered by people who understand what they gave and why it mattered. The next few months are going to be critical. The decisions made by leaders in Washington, in Ottawa, in capitals across Europe and around the world will shape the global order for decades to come. And ordinary citizens like you and me have more power to influence those decisions than we often realize. By staying informed, by making our voices heard, by refusing to accept the normalization of behavior that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, we can help determine which direction our world takes. George Conway has dedicated himself to speaking truth about these dangers, even at great personal cost. He has sacrificed relationships and endured attacks because he believes that some things are more important than political convenience. That kind of courage is rare, and it deserves our attention and our respect. The alliance between democratic nations, the partnership between America and its allies, the memory of those who died defending freedom, these are things worth protecting. And protecting them begins with understanding the threats they face. Thank you for watching this video to the end. I know it covered difficult and disturbing material, but I believe that confronting difficult truths is better than comfortable ignorance. The world is changing rapidly, and we all have a responsibility to understand those changes and to do what we can to shape them for the better. If you found this video valuable, please hit the like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Your engagement helps this content reach more people who need to understand what is happening. And if you have not already subscribed, please do so now and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on these crucial global developments. The story is far from over. In fact, it may just be beginning. And I will be here to help you understand every twist and turn as it unfolds. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop questioning those who hold power.